Brilliant, thank you. Okay, well, welcome everybody to the International Day of Human Spaceflight. It is the joint anniversary of Yuri Gagarin when he did his first man in space in 1961. And it's also the anniversary of the first space shuttle launch, the 12th of April 1981, which was STS-1 for Columbia. Now, my last talk was talking about the history of rockets, which took you up to and including a little bit of the Yuri Gagarin spaceflight. So for this time round, I'll do the history of the space shuttle. So some of the things that I'll be covering, I'll be looking at the story behind the development, why they decided to do it, the shuttle fleet itself and what it was made up of, how they launched the shuttle, what the shuttle actually did, how they brought it back to Earth, and then of course its decommission when it was no longer required. So it was literally the end of an era, a truly technological feat of engineering. A bit ahead of its time, I think, because we're trying to emulate some of the things now, like the reusability with SpaceX. So how did the space shuttle actually come about then? Well, our story starts back in the late 60s, even before man first landed on the moon, when NASA decided, what do we want to do once we've been to the moon? So the easy answer would be go to Mars, but they needed to do a lot more to make sure that they had the technology to be able to do that. So the idea that they wanted to do was to have manned space stations in low Earth orbit, which you've got down here. You'll also have one in lunar orbit. You'll have some nuclear shuttles that can move things backwards and forwards, and you'll have space tugs that can move the stations around and put them into their different orbits. But then, of course, once you've got all of that, you need to get up and down to low Earth orbit in the first place. So that's where the space shuttle came along. So it was kind of an afterthought of this big master plan that they wanted to do. And the idea was then they would use the nuclear stage part of all of this to then go to Mars with a projection date of 1983. But unfortunately, due to budget cuts, the euphoria era of 1968 that they had with all of this money and everything, budget cuts came along. The Vietnam War had a big impact on the finance for America. The Great Society budget deficit, which was something that Lyndon B. Johnson brought up when he was in office, where they would help the poor. They had some deficit towards that. They had the oil crisis in 1973. And Nixon himself wasn't actually a big supporter of the space industry. So just to give you an idea, the manned spaceflight budget in 1966 was 3.8 billion, and by 1972 it had been cut to 1.78 billion. So into the 1970s then, the shuttle then became a priority because they wanted to cut all of this stuff. They couldn't do everything, but the main thing they needed to do is to be able to get backwards and forwards in the first place. So they designed the shuttle with the pretext that everything else would come along later on. So it was sort of like a low cost, it's the afterthought to get them backwards and forwards like the taxi. So they cancelled Apollo because we were supposed to be having 19 of those, and the Apollo 18 and Apollo 19 got cancelled. The second Skylab got cancelled, Skylab B, a picture of which you can see here, which is at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. You've got the space tugs and the nuclear stages were also taken away, and they cancelled the Mars program. Well, they didn't cancel the Mars, they deferred the Mars program just for a long time. And the industry, the people in the industry were cut from 400,000 people to 150,000 people. So it was a big slice of what they had planned, just down to the space shuttle. So that's what they were left with, just the space shuttle from this elaborate plan in the 1970s. But they were still having money issues. So they needed to try and fund this. And the military agreed that they would be able to help fund this, but it needed to meet specifications for them to be able to use it so they could help fund it. So the payload itself needed to be 15 foot by 60 feet. Originally, it was designed at 40 feet, but it needed to be 60 feet because the military satellites that they needed to put up were 60 feet long. and the 15 feet was the size of a normal where you could live inside a space station. So that's why they chose those dimensions. It needed to have a cross range of 1,500 miles. The reason for that is if you take off a point in the Earth, go on a polar orbit, come back round and try and land in the same place, because the Earth has started to rotate, when you come back to the same place, it would have moved by 1,500 miles. So this is why they needed that 1,500 miles cross range, so that they could deploy one of their satellites into orbit in one go and then coming back to the same place, but then be able to make up the 1,500 miles to be able to land again. Needed to have a reusable thermal protection system and 2 fully recoverable piloted stages, because they wanted to make this cost effective. The idea for the space shuttle was they had visions of it doing loads and loads of launches a year to make its money up. So for the cross range point of view, they didn't want to put an engine on it, because then it'd have to carry extra fuel and it would also have to be relit in the middle of the flight. So they brought it in to try to bring it in like a glider, and they'd already had those capabilities back in the day with the X-20. Never came into fruition, but they certainly drew up the plans for it, probably known as the Dinosaur, which is the plane that then they copied to try and get up this 1,500 miles range capability. So they could bring that in like a glider, but they'd also need some heat protection. And what they used here was the thermal protection system of the silica tiles. The silica tiles were made of granite sand, so they could shed 95% of the heat and only absorb 5% of the rest of the heat. And they were glued around the outside. Each of them were individually numbered to fit around the outside of the space shuttle. So I've got a picture of that later on. From the reusability side, so we'd already got the shuttle itself that was coming back down, so it needed to be 2-stage reusability, and the second stage was these ones here, which were the solid rocket boosters. This bit here is the external tank that sat along the back, and that bit wasn't recovered. So these 2 solid rocket boosters were then deployed after launch and then landed in the ocean by parachutes and then recovered by some boats, and we'll see some pictures of the tugboats later on. So that's really the makeup of the shuttle and why we decided to make it the way that it was done. So now we had to test to make sure it could do what it needed to do. So they built a test orbiter. So we welcomed the test orbiter, the very first one, Constitution. Yes, I kid you not, originally it was called Constitution. But then fans of a very famous 1960s TV series rallied round to get its name changed to Enterprise. It was then tested at Edward Air Force Base in America between February and October 1977, where it did 16 test flights, all called ALT-1 to AL-16. The ALT stood for Approach and Landing Test. So there was 2 crews that was done. So you got the first crew here, you had Fullerton and Hayes, and then Engel and Truly for the second crew. So the first ALT-1 to ALT-8 were all done just by jumbo jet. So it just fly on the top of the jumbo jet and come back down again. The second 8, ALT-9 to AL-16, each of these crews did 4 each, and they took it off the jumbo jet. The jumbo jet then released it and they floated or glided back down to Earth. And they were all successful, so it was all given the green light. Now, the space shuttle could carry 7 passengers. Up to that point, you'd only had a maximum of 3. And even the Soyuz now only takes 3, and even the new SpaceX only takes 4. So it's quite unique. So it was an opportunity to bring extra people on board other than just pilots and engineers, probably scientists and payload specialists. So they put out a call on the next round of astronaut recruitment, and they recruited 35 astronauts. They were nicknamed the 35 new guys, and they were all astronaut group 8, and they were all chosen to ride the shuttle during the 1980s. So here are the 35 new guys. So they were selected in January 1978. Some of the names you'll probably recognize. You've got Sally Ride down here. You've got Onizuka, Resnick, and McNair, who all unfortunately passed away during the Challenger disaster. You've got Dick Covey here, who was the Capcom for the Challenger disaster and also did the return to flight in Discovery for STS-26. So lots of names you'll recognize there. And these were the 35 that were originally set up to do that. And they consisted of pilots, mission specialists, and they were all from different backgrounds, races, religions, sexes, and all sorts of stuff like that. So it wasn't just down to men who could fly for the military. So it's a great opportunity. So the final design of the space shuttle then. So here we have the space shuttle, or do we? No, that is just the orbiter vehicle. And that, along with the external fuel tank that I mentioned earlier and the solid rocket boosters, those 3 bits combined give us the space shuttle as we know it. So each of those components then, the solid rocket boosters, they were about 150 feet in length, and they were 12 feet in diameter. And the reason why they were 12 feet in diameter is that was the widest they could be to be transported by rail. So that's how they needed to be transported backwards and forwards. So 12 feet was the optimum diameter for those. So why solid rocket boosters? Well, it gave you good thrust, but people didn't like using solid rocket boosters. If you use a liquid engine, you've got your fuel and your oxidizer that gets pumped into the turbo pumps, then into the combustion chamber and out through the converging diverging nozzle. If at any point you wanted to turn those off, you can flick valves to stop the fuel or the oxidizer or even both from flowing and therefore not reaching the combustion chamber. A solid rocket engine has the fuel and the oxidizer already in one complete unit called the grain, and then they sit inside, it looks like a really large candle with a hole down the middle. There's an igniter at the top, and when that's lit and the flame goes down there, 6 seconds later you're going somewhere whether you want to or not. So you cannot turn it off. So nobody was really a fan of it, but it really did give you the thrust that you needed to escape orbit. So this is what it looked like. So this was the solid rocket booster. So you've got your grain, which was your fuel, and your oxidizer and your binder that put it all together. It's really quite a monster thing, and because it was so monstrous, they had to ship it in by rail in pieces and then assemble it while it was at Kennedy Space Center in the vehicle assembly building. So these things then would connect together, and they would connect by using these O-rings here, which were sort of like rubber washer grommet things like you'd get in plumbing, just a little bit bigger. And then they would make a seal, but then as the fuel would heat, they would then expand and create the seal to stop anything from coming through. They were recovered, as I said. They would be released during launch, parachuted down into the ocean, and then collected by the tugboats. And out of all of the 270 solid rocket boosters that were sent up, the 135 flights, 2 on each, only 4 of them were not returned. There were the 2 on STS-4 because of parachute failures, and the 2 on the Challenger disaster, the STS-51L. All of the others came back. So yes, at the time, we were doing reusability right from the early 80s. The next part then, the external fuel tank, is about 155 feet tall, just under. It's about 27, 28 feet in diameter, and it is the heaviest part of it, of the entire structure when it's full of fuel. So it would be in 3 compartments. So you'd have the liquid oxygen tank at the front, you'd have the hydrogen oxygen tank at the back, and then you'd add an unpressurized intertank into the in the middle there. So it separates the two, and it's also quite handy because that's where they put the front bracket for mounting it to the actual space shuttle itself. You can see here that the two sizes are different. That's because of the different densities of the liquid oxygen and the liquid hydrogen. So you need more of the liquid hydrogen to you do to the liquid oxygen. And to keep this moving, you've got the little baffles here that would spin along with the slosh baffles. It's a bit like you're getting a slush puppy machine to stop the ice from keep it moving, to stop it from solidifying. And this is where it would mount it. So that's the part of the front where it would mount to the space shuttle. And then you've got the two little bits at the back that's not only with a mounting, but also all of the fuel pipes and everything that would go in, because this was the fuel tank for the space shuttle main engine. So once the space shuttle main engine would fire, once all of this fuel was then depleted, the space shuttle main engine was no more, and this tank could then be jettisoned to save weight. So these are the first three flights, the STS-1, STS-2 and STS-3. And the first thing that you notice is that on STS-3, the external fuel tank is a different color. The reason for that is in the earlier flights for STS-1 and STS-2, NASA painted it white to make it look nice. And then they realized, why are we wasting all this money and weight as well? Because I believe it was something like 300 kilos that they saved by not painting it. When they could just use the uncoated brown color, because all it was going to do is be jettisoned into the ocean once the fuel had depleted. So this is a picture that was taken by Dave Eagle, and he's allowed me to use that. And you can see this is the orbital vehicle on the top there, and underneath you can see the darker color external fuel tank as it's being jettisoned during its flight. So if I zoom in there, you can see the difference between the two colors. So the orbiter vehicle, so this is where the crew and everything would sit, and that was made up of three parts. So you've got your crew compartment at the front, you've got your cargo bay in the middle, and you've got your engines at the back. So the cargo bay itself, you've got everything that you would need in there. So you'd have your flight deck up here where you'd have 4 passengers, and then you'd have another 3 down below. But then you can store the seats in the lower deck if you needed to, along with anything that you needed while you're in flight. There's also a toilet on board, and you'd sleep in little cupboards that were built in the side, and you'd have all your equipment and everything in storage here. On the side around the nozzle and on the side of it, there are 40 what's called RCS, reaction control systems, little thrusts or bursts of gas that would go out so that you could fine tune where you were steering the orbiter vehicle. The payload bay itself, as I said, it was now its spec was 15 feet by 60 feet. There was also an arm here that was made by the Canadian Space. So our friend from Canada, thank you very much for your contribution to that. It's also on the International Space Station as well. And I must say the Canadians are very good at doing robotic arms for everyone within the space industry. The airlock itself is got 2 ways in or out, so you could go through the side here straight out into the cargo bay, as you can see on there, or you can come through the top, which is where it would dock to things like the International Space Station, so that you could then use it to transport backwards and forwards. And under the doors here, you can see this grey area here. These are literally large radiators. Because there is so much heat and everything that gets built up in the orbiter vehicle, it can open up the payload doors and dissipate a lot of that heat out into space so that it doesn't overheat. So yeah, another little amazing design that makes use of all of this big space. The engines themselves, so it's broken down into 2 parts. You've got the Space Shuttle main engines, which are here, the ones in red, and they are RS-25 engines, and they would fire during launch and get fuel directly from the external fuel tank. And when the external fuel tank was empty and jettisoned, these were literally dead weight. Then they can be used over and over again, and they didn't have any catastrophic failures during their time aboard the aboard the space shuttle, and they're even the engines that are being used for the new SLS. So it'd be interesting to see how they carry on, proven and tested during the space shuttle. You've got the other little ones called the OMS, the Orbital Maneuvering System. These were tiny little AJ-10-190 engines that would be used to maneuver around, get it into orbit, and also when they're deorbiting as well. And I'll show you about that when the landing comes along. The tile protection system, as I mentioned earlier, made of silicon, and they were all individually numbered and shaped so that they could fit round all of the orbiter vehicles, because they're all, every part of it was a different shape and size, and they needed to be cut to fit. And there was about roughly 30,000 on each one. In the early days, they had trouble gluing them on. They couldn't quite work out how to make them stick, so they had to redesign the adhesive to make that happen. So this was the entire fleet then. So you had all of the 6 here, which included the Enterprise. They were all given a different OV number. Now, originally, the OV-0s were the test vehicles, and the OV-1s were due to go into orbit. Challenger was given OV-099 because it was only made as a structure model, just so they could see how it would work. Enterprise was originally due to be upgraded so that it could then go into orbit, but when they built Columbia, there was too many modifications that was too expensive to modify Enterprise to make it go into orbit. So it was easier to modify Challenger because it was a lower scale model at the time, which is why Challenger went into orbit and Enterprise didn't, but it still kept its OV designation of the 0 at the front. Unfortunately, we lost Columbia and Challenger during the Space Shuttle time, but the others are still around. The Space Shuttle Atlantis is at the Kennedy Space Center, the visitors complex. Space Shuttle Discovery is at the Stephen Utzar Hazy Center, which is part of the Smithsonian Center in Washington. You've got the Space Shuttle Endeavour, and that's in the California Space Center or the Science Center, and the Enterprise is in the Intrepid Air and Space Museum in New York. So they're all still about if you want to go and see them, unfortunately, apart from Columbia and Challenger, but you will be able to see those in the Memorial Garden again, something I'll come on to a little bit later in the presentation. So this is Space Shuttle Atlantis, taken by a friend of mine, Tom Clark, who's a member of my local society. These are the 3 areas of the Space Shuttle in real life. So you've got the crew compartment at the front, you've got the payload bay with the radiators and the robotic arm, and then you can see here the engines at the back and a person there, just to give you some idea of scale on how big these things actually were. So that's the shuttle itself and how it got to design. But now it's time for liftoff. So its first mission, STS-1, stood for Space Transportation System, because that's what it was originally designed to do, transport things backwards and forwards to space. And it was on the 12th of April, 1981, which was 41 years ago today. So it's the 20th anniversary of the first human spaceflight. So that happened in 1961, which is why we have International Day of Human Spaceflight today. And it was the first US vehicle to be manned on its maiden flight. So all of the Mercuries, the Apollos, the Geminis, all up to that point had an unmanned test flight. This one, they put a person in straight away because it was feasible to do so. It wouldn't work properly if they were to do it robotically. It was the first use of solid rocket boosters. As I said, people didn't really like to use them because you couldn't shut them off. But it made sense to use it for this design because the thrust that it gave you was a lot better than other options that were available at the time. And John Young became the first person to fly 4 different classes of space vehicle when he flew this along with Crippen. So he'd flown Gemini, the Apollo Command Service Module, the Apollo Lander, and here the Space Shuttle. And to my understanding, he's the only person still ever to have done that. I keep trying to think look back to see if anyone else, and at the moment I haven't come up with anyone. So STS-1 to STS-9. So the first 4 flights were all Columbia, and they were all test flights. They were all 2-person crew. STS-5 was the first 4-person crew, and then from then onwards, STS-6 to STS-8 were all Challenger, and that included Sally Ride, which is the first woman in space during that time. And then STS-9 was Space Lab 1, and that was back to Columbia. So Columbia and Challenger at the time were doing most of the work. And you notice the numbering system, quite straightforward. STS, Space Transportation System 1 to 9. But then we started to go a bit weird. So you started to see things like STS-41B, STS-51G, STS-61C, and yet they were still sequential. And the reason for that was because they wanted to bring in extra orbiters and do a lot more flights. So they needed to bring in a more structured numbering system. So the idea was to allow for this increase in the number of orbiters, but also allow to use Vandenberg Air Force Base over on the other side of America. Because from where you are at Kennedy Space Center, you cannot fly straight over the poles to do a polar orbit. You needed to do Vandenberg Air Force Base over this side so that you could fly directly down over water and still over the poles, because the best you could do here was 39 degrees that way, 57 degrees that way. So they wanted to use Vandenberg. So the numbering system that they used, STS, they kept that for the Space Transportation System. The first number that you can see is the fiscal year that the mission was created. So this one would have been 1984, this one would have been 1985, this one would have been 1986. Now, unfortunately, the fiscal year for NASA runs from October to September. So it's not a calendar year that all of these were introduced. The second number is the Kennedy Space Center or Vandenberg Airfield. So all of these are 1, so they all took off from Kennedy Space Center. And a letter is the mission order that was decided in that fiscal year. So although you've got STS-51B that took off after STS-51C, it's because this one was given its designation before that one, even though 51C took off earlier. The other thing that was suggested, the numbering system, was a guy called James Beggs, who apparently had trichodecaphobia, which is the fear of the number 13. And he introduced this numbering system to try and avoid using the number 13, like the Apollo 13, which didn't work out so well. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but this is the reason that most people have gone for the increase in orbiters. Although interestingly enough, STS-41G, which is here, which was the 13th mission, landed on Friday, the 13th of October, 1984. So he didn't actually get away with it in the end. So we kept that numbering system until this, Challenger. Challenger changed everything for the Space Shuttle for a lot of reasons. They scaled back the number of flights that they wanted to do. They decided not to use Vandenberg anymore. And because of all of that, they then referred back to the original numbering system. So this was the 25th flight, Challenger. So they started again at STS-26, STS-27, and STS-28. So that's why in the early stages of the Space Shuttle missions, you had this unusual numbering system, but it was structured, but it didn't last very long. So launching the shuttle then. So everything was assembled at the vehicle assembly building. If anybody's seen it, it's one massive building. It actually looks quite small, the Space Shuttle there, because this building was designed to do the Saturn V rocket. So you can imagine how big the Saturn V was. I think it's twice the size of the Space Shuttle. So it would roll out on this thing called a crawler. So this took all of the Saturn V's out, it took all of the space shuttles out, and recently it even took the SLS out to do its dry testing. So that's due to happen very, very soon. It's dry run. So the crawler itself, it only goes 2 miles an hour, so it's very, very slow, and it takes a while for it to get from here to its launch pad. Now, the difference between this and the Saturn V rocket is that this crawler took the space shuttle to its launch pad, whereas in the Saturn V days, the Saturn V was already carrying its launch pad with it. And the difference is it's purely because of size. And as I say, it's twice the height, so it's about 200 feet as opposed to nearly 400 feet. So it was able to rocket up to its launch pad, but it was just too big for the Saturn V to be able to do that. Launch-wise then, so it would lift off from Kennedy Space Center, and about 2 minutes into its flight, it would jettison its solid rocket boosters back into the ocean to then be retrieved. And then about 8 minutes in, it would then jettison the external tank, which would then come down in the Pacific Ocean, and that would not be recovered. So there's a little vast build-up of those happening in the Pacific Ocean down there. And then it would use its OMS, its orbital maneuvering system, to fire its engines to go into low Earth orbit. So when a launch went wrong then, so I've already spoken about the Challenger disaster. And the story behind that started in 1984 when 3 years into the space shuttle, things were starting to get a little bit boring and routine for space flight. So Ronald Reagan decided that he would put some life back into it, and he announced that they would be sending the first citizen into space, and they wanted it to be a teacher, someone with inspiration and someone who can then teach their findings while in orbit and also when they got back to Earth. 11,000 people applied, and it was narrowed down to 2 candidates from each state who were then put forward, and eventually in 1985 Krista McAuliffe was chosen as the primary candidate, and then there was a backup, because there's always backup crews for these. Barbara Morgan was the backup teacher who was also chosen and went through the same training as Krista McAuliffe. In 1986, after many delays of the flight, they finally went off on a very cold January day, and unfortunately they exploded short way into the flight. The reason was because of exhaust or flare came out of the solid rocket booster, and it was down to a breach in the O-rings. Because it was a cold day, it was deemed that they got very cold and brittle and couldn't hold their form when it was really, really cold. So the fact that it was a really cold day had a massive impact on why the disaster actually happened. But they knew about these O-rings. They'd recovered other space shuttles, examined them, because they put these solid rocket boosters back together and they could see that this was starting to happen. The owner, Thiokol, also knew about the issue, and they tried to stop NASA from flying even on that day. But NASA signed a waiver to continue the flights until a solution was examined, but unfortunately they pushed their luck once too often, and Challenger was the casualty. It did ground the flight for nearly 3 years, so from January 1986, and they didn't go back up until September 88. They improved the solid rocket booster design so that these breaches couldn't happen, and there were new rules on passengers and cargo. So because of that, that's why they didn't start using Vandenberg. That's why they cut down on the number of flights that they would do, and why they changed the numbering system. But they were back up and running, STS-26, September the 29th, 1988. And this gentleman here I mentioned at the beginning, Dick Covey, he was in charge of the return to flight, and it was the Discovery that did to return to flight. In my opinion, the best shuttle, did the most miles, did the most launches, and was probably, in my opinion, the most reliable. So what were the main achievements of the Space Shuttle then? Well, it launched Hubble in STS-31. It was the 35th mission, which I believe Tracy's got the model of behind her. So that was April 1990. And it also did the Hubble repair as well. So the first Hubble telescope servicing mission and the 5th flight of the Space Shuttle Endeavour fixed the Hubble in December 1993 when it turned out that they'd not ground the mirror as well as they could. So they basically went up there and they put a pair of specs on it so that it could change its vision. It helped launch the ISS. So the Zarya, which was the Russian module, was the first ISS module that was launched by a Proton rocket back in 1998, about a month before in November. And then STS-88 followed with the Unity probe 2 weeks later. And because of the space shuttle's robotic arm, it made it so much easier to be able to assemble those modules in space. Also gave us the first female commander, who was this lady here, Eileen Collins. She was selected as an astronaut in 1990. She was the pilot aboard the 1995 and the 1997 missions, and she was the first female commander on STS-93 in 1999, which as you can see here, probably recognise that. That's the Chandra Observatory, the X-ray telescope. They deployed that. So it was a milestone, and because of the space shuttle having the opportunity to launch so many people, it gave Eileen Collins those sorts of opportunities, along with Sally Ride, who probably would not have got them if they carried on doing 2 or 3 crews per flight. So the landing of the shuttle then, how did it come back down? Well, it's used all its fuel, it's depleted all its fuel tanks, so it's got rid of its solid rocket boosters, it's got rid of its external fuel tank. It would normally fly upside down, so that it would the thermal protection system on the back there would be out towards space, so that would be protecting it, and also sometimes it'd be flying backwards as well, so that anything that's debris that's coming up wouldn't hit the crew compartment, it would hit the back and not hurt the astronauts. But if it was flying in this direction, it would flip around. It would then flip over using its OMS, its orbital maneuvering system, and then it would pitch its way down at an angle of about 40 degrees when it comes into the atmosphere. So that's where the thermal protection system comes in, because it's really getting hot under there. You're talking 1500 degrees when it comes in. It does a series of S-bends as it comes in, and that helps to deplete some of the energy and helps it to slow down. And it would come in at a really steep angle, and then just at the last minute it would raise its nose to touch down, and its parachute would come out. So it would glide in. The only engines it would use was when it come out of space, because once it hits the atmosphere, it's then in the air environment that they can use to glide it in. It will land at one of 3 sites. Ideally, it would land at the Kennedy Space Center. It only landed at White Sands once due to a flood at the Edwards Air Force Base. But if the Kennedy Space Center was unavailable, it would land at the Edwards Air Force Base as a backup. But if it did land at either of these 2, it would then have to go on to a jumbo jet, modified jumbo jet, to take it back. And there's lots of refueling that has to go on. So they prefer to do it at Kennedy Space Center. Otherwise, there's lots of fuel to get it back. So when a landing went wrong, so we had a launch that didn't go so well, but we also had a casualty of Columbia when it came back, the STS-107. So in 2003, on its launch, it was struck by a piece of foam that was come off. It struck the near side of the wing, And NASA actually knew this had happened. They'd seen the cameras of it, but they didn't think it would cause it too much damage. What had actually happened is that it had taken off on 2003. It had struck the wing and actually caused a crack in the protection system there. So when it came back in February 2003, the heat got inside the wing and just penetrated and destroyed the vehicle on re-entry. So tributes to their memory. So on Mars, if anybody was there for my NASA Does Nostalgia, I mentioned this, that the Spirit's landing site, one of the Mars rovers, was ceremoniously named after the Columbian Memorial Station. There's 7 asteroids that's orbiting between the Mars and Jupiter that bear the crew's names. And in 2015, the Kennedy Space Center opened the first NASA exhibit to display debris from both Challenger and the Columbia missions. And as I said earlier, you can see the other orbiters, and this is where you have the opportunity to see what's left of the Challenger and Columbia missions. And it was called the Forever Remembered Garden, and it's a permanent exhibit that contains the Challenger's fuselage and the window frames of the Columbia. So again, another investigation, some more downtime, but we did go back. STS-114, yet again, Discovery was the return to flight. So it did both return to flights, and it launched on July 26, 2005. And in command of that was Eileen Collins. So it's the second time she was in command. So good, big responsibility there, but why not? You know, we're in an era of, it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. In science now, we're encouraging everybody to get in there, and that was what the space shuttle was all about. It was about encouraging all different people, science background, to the opportunity to go into space and do what they needed to do. But that was the end of an era for the space shuttle, unfortunately. In January 2004, President Bush then made his speech, which included the shuttle is an aging system, but still developmental in character. It's in the nation's interest to replace the shuttle as soon as possible. He did vow that America will finish what it started by completing the International Space Station by 2010. Research on the station will be focused on studying the long-term effects of space travel and preparing for what's next. And the space shuttle retired after 30 years of duty, which happened in 2011. He did unveil the next big thing to gain a foothold on the moon and to prepare for the new journeys onwards beyond our own. And that was the Constellation program, which subsequently turned into Orion and has now developed into Artemis, which is what we're doing now. New rules then were established for the last 7 or 8 years of the space shuttle. So every mission was treated as a return to flight. Wasn't the intention. They wanted to ramp these things up to try and get the reusability out of it, because the more flights that they could do a year, the more they were going to get return on investment. But this wasn't the case now. It was safety first. Shuttle's external tank was redesigned so that the foam couldn't fall off it as easily. And astronauts used cameras on the robotic arm to scan the shuttle's belly for broken tiles. So it was extended from 40 feet to 50 feet. So it was able to photograph underneath the belly. They had more camera views of the shuttle during liftoff so that they could better understand debris that was going to be hitting the shuttle. It would do a belly flip on approach to the ISS, so it would turn over so that the people on the ISS could visually scan to see if there was any faults or any penetrations to the protection system. And the International Space Station was viewed as a safe haven, so astronauts could shelter there in case of any foam malfunction during launch. So they weren't able to go anywhere where they weren't able to reach the International Space Station, which at the time meant that we couldn't go to Hubble, because you couldn't go to Hubble and then onto the International Space Station. There was this though, STS-118 Endeavour in August 2007. So you can see there was some debris hit that, of course, created some media frenzy. And this was actually taken by, thankfully it was okay, but this was taken, this picture, STS-118, was taken by Dave Eagle while it was in flight. And the significance behind this, you probably recognize some of these names, Kelly and Morgan. That was Scott Kelly, who was the one that done A Year in Space, who was up there at the same time as Tim Peake. And Morgan was Barbara Morgan. She was the backup teacher for Kristen McAuliffe. So she managed to get into space on STS-118 in 2007. And there was an exception that was made eventually for the Hubble, because only ISS missions could take place. So with the exception to the ISS missions were this one, STS-125, which was a successful 2009 flight to resurface the Hubble Space Telescope. It was originally cancelled in 2004 because of concerns of the Challenger, the Columbia disaster. But the mission was reinstated in 2006 as a one-off to upgrade it. And we're still making use of those marvelous pictures now, thankfully to that upgrade. So its last flight then, STS-135, which was the 8th of July 2011, which is 10 years ago this July. It was Space Shuttle Atlantis. This is Space Shuttle Atlantis on takeoff, again taken by Dave Eagle as it transits the Sun. And it was the 135th and final mission of the American Space Shuttle program. It was launched on the 8th of July 2011. It's a 4-person crew, so it was the smallest of any shuttle since STS-6 since 1983. And they carried a flag that was flown on STS-1 that was delivered to the space station for the next US crew mission to collect. And then it landed. It's for the final time on the 21st of July 2011. Now, if I go back a slide to the names, you could probably see there Hurley as part of the crew. Now, that was Doug Hurley, who along with Bob Benkin went on the Crew Dragon Demo Mission 2 in the 1st of June 2020. And he was the same person that went up there to then retrieve the flag on the return flight to relaunch America back to be able to go back to the space station. So good on Doug Hurley. So people say, was it worth it? Was it not? I'm in the was it worth it camp. Yes, because at the time it continued the space program during a period that the US was financially struggling and they needed to do something. So they managed to do this low Earth orbit taxi, which continued then to help build the space station and launch other shuttles. It was actually a really impressive feat of engineering. If you think about some of the things that we've done now, very, very similar things were done with the space shuttle, with the reusability and the storing and stowing of cargo and the robotic arm that was then developed and used on the ISS itself. It allowed the more diverse crew selection. I keep going on about that. It wasn't just men who could fly a machine from the military. It opened opportunities to different sexes, races, religions, scientists, and all sorts to do work that they probably wouldn't have had the opportunity to do otherwise. It saved the Hubble Space Telescope. If anything would have happened to it without the space shuttle around, there's no way we would have got up there to be able to fix it and also service it. It was designed to be serviceable because we had the space shuttle, but now we can't even go up there and change the stuff. If anything breaks on it now, that's it. We can't get back to it. It helped and launched and assembled the ISS. Arguably, we could have done that without the space shuttle, but the space shuttle made it a darn sight easier. And developed scientific advancements that helped us on Earth. So not just in our everyday, but also in aircraft and military as well. So there we go. I give you the history of probably one of the most complex flying machines that man has ever made, the space shuttle.